I was mid-sentence when it happened. The notification slid onto my tablet screen with the cold precision of an assassin's blade. Marin Blake, employment terminated, effective immediately. Please exit systems post-pitch. 12 executives from Tridentor sat across the conference table, their eyes fixed on my presentation. The room's acoustics amplified every sound: the gentle hum of the climate control, the occasional tap of a stylus against a tablet, the subtle shift of weight in Italian leather chairs. None of them saw the notification. Only I did. The blood rushed to my ears as I paused, barely a microsecond, before continuing my sentence about quarterly implementation metrics as if nothing had happened. As if HR hadn't just fired me while I was presenting the $72 million deal I'd cultivated for 8 months. And as you can see on slide 9, the integration pathway creates a 26% efficiency gain in the first 2 quarters alone, I said, my voice betraying nothing. 8 months of work, terminated in 8 seconds of text. I didn't plead. I didn't storm out. I finished the presentation. When the CFO of Tridentor nodded with satisfaction at the final projections, I simply closed my tablet, thanked them for their time, and walked out of the room with the same measured confidence I'd walked in with. They thought silencing me mid-pitch would kill my influence. Instead, it killed their entire future pipeline. Because what Rivenix Group didn't understand was that I'd already built something they couldn't touch. My name is Marin Blake. I was 36 years old and had been a senior client strategist at Rivenix for nearly 5 years when they fired me. This is the story of how I lost my job in 8 seconds and how my former company lost everything in the aftermath. 3 months before that fateful presentation, I received a curious request from Grayson Holt, our CEO. He asked me to draft a comprehensive proposal for merging our 3 strategic divisions, something that had been discussed theoretically but never seriously pursued. I need someone with your strategic mind on this, Marin, he'd said, leaning back in his chair during our one-on-one meeting. Something visionary but executable. You know the terrain better than anyone. I spent 3 weeks building that proposal. It was meticulous, a 78-page document outlining every aspect of the merger, from personnel integration to client communication strategies. I factored in the cultural differences between divisions, the technical challenges of merging 3 different workflow systems, and created a 24-month roadmap that minimized disruption while maximizing growth potential. When I submitted it to Grayson, he seemed genuinely impressed. This is exactly what we needed. Let me review it with the board and get back to you. 2 days later, I received an invitation to a company-wide strategy meeting. When I arrived, Lucien Vall was standing at the front of the room. Lucien had joined Rivenix just 6 months earlier as Deputy Director of Operations, a position created specifically for him after a brief stint at one of our competitors. He had the kind of charisma that made people want to follow him, combined with the kind of ambition that made me instinctively wary. As the presentation began, I realized with growing disbelief that Lucien was presenting my merger proposal, verbatim in many places, as his own work. My name had been completely erased. In its place was strategic initiative developed by Lucien Vall, with contributions from the operations team. When our eyes met across the room, I saw not guilt but challenge, as if daring me to object. I didn't, not then, not publicly. Instead, I nodded slightly, maintained a professional expression, and took notes as if I were hearing all of this for the first time. Around me, colleagues were nodding, impressed by Lucien's vision. Grayson stood to the side, looking pleased with his deputy's apparent brilliance. That evening, I began a new folder on my personal drive. I named it Altovia Systems. At that point, it was just a place to store evidence, screenshots of my original documents with metadata intact, email trails showing my submission to Grayson, recorded changes in access permissions that had quietly removed me as document owner. I didn't know yet what Altovia would become. I just knew I needed to protect myself. The next few weeks brought subtle but unmistakable changes. I found myself excluded from email threads where I'd previously been a key contributor. Document permissions that once granted me editing access were downgraded to view only. My name disappeared from reporting structures where I'd previously held leadership positions. Then came the replacement, a junior strategist named Talia, who'd been with the company for less than a year. I'd actually mentored her when she first joined. Now she was being positioned as my successor before I'd even left. "We want Talia to shadow you on the Tridentor project," my direct supervisor informed me. "Grayson thinks it's time she got some exposure to our top-tier clients." I agreed without hesitation. "She's talented. I'm happy to bring her up to speed." What I didn't say was that I'd already seen the writing on the wall. This wasn't professional development. This was preparation for my removal. The final confirmation came when HR scheduled a position review meeting with me. Morgan Frist, our human resources director, sat across from me with a manufactured smile and a folder of documents I wasn't permitted to see. "We're just assessing team structures in light of the upcoming merger," she explained. "Everyone's roles are being evaluated." "Everyone's?" I asked mildly. "Of course," she replied, but her eyes shifted away momentarily. "Has Lucian's role been evaluated yet?" I kept my tone casual, merely curious. A flicker of unease crossed her face. "Senior leadership positions are being assessed separately." I nodded as if this made perfect sense. While understanding completely what was happening, this wasn't an evaluation. This was preparation for elimination. That evening, I activated Phase 2 of what was becoming my contingency plan, using the contract terms I'd helped draft years earlier, terms that granted employees continued access to their work product for portfolio purposes. I began systematically backing up key files to my personal system. These weren't confidential client files or proprietary company information. I was careful about that. These were the strategic frameworks I'd developed, the implementation roadmaps I'd created, the presentation templates and analytical models that bore my intellectual imprint, all things I was legally entitled to as their creator. I also reached out to 2 former colleagues who had left Rivenix the previous year, Ilara Jennings from Legal and Darian Voss from Audit. We met for what appeared to be a casual dinner, but the conversation quickly turned serious. "I'm creating something new," I told them after ensuring we had privacy, "something that will exist parallel to Rivenix for now, but eventually," I left the sentence unfinished. Ilara, ever the cautious legal mind, leaned forward. "Are you asking us to help you compete with your current employer? Because that's problematic territory." "Marin, I'm not competing with them," I replied carefully. "Not yet. I'm simply building a structure that could operate independently if needed. And I'm doing it within the boundaries of my contract." Darian, who had always appreciated strategic maneuvering, smiled slightly. "You're expecting to be pushed out." It wasn't a question, but I answered anyway. "I'm preparing for all contingencies." By the time I walked into that fateful presentation with Tridentor, Altovia Systems existed as more than just a folder name. It had a legal structure, a rudimentary operating framework, and 2 trusted associates ready to activate it if necessary. It wasn't a competitor to Rivenix, not yet, but it was poised to become one with remarkable speed if circumstances demanded. The Tridentor deal had been my project from inception. The global manufacturing conglomerate was looking to overhaul their entire client engagement system, a massive undertaking that would transform how they interacted with customers across 17 countries. I had personally cultivated the relationship with their executive team, identified their pain points, and designed a solution that would revolutionize their customer experience while generating substantial recurring revenue for Rivenix. When I arrived at their headquarters that morning for the final pitch, I noticed something odd. Lucian was there, sitting quietly at the back of the preparation room. He hadn't been involved in any previous meetings with Tridentor. "Grayson thought I should observe today," he explained with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, "for continuity purposes." I nodded, understanding the subtext. They were already planning for my absence. The presentation began precisely at 10 Hazuros a.m. I had rehearsed it countless times, knew every slide, every transition, every potential question. The Tridentor executives were engaged, asking insightful questions that I answered with depth and precision. Their CFO, a notoriously difficult woman to impress, was nodding along with my revenue projections. I was on slide 9, explaining the implementation timeline, when the notification arrived. After completing the presentation and exiting with dignity intact, I walked directly to my car. I didn't return to the Rivenix office to clear out my desk or say goodbye to colleagues. There was no need. Everything important was already secured elsewhere. As I drove away, my phone began buzzing with messages from confused colleagues who had somehow heard the news already. I ignored them all. This wasn't the time for explanations or goodbyes. This was the time for executing the contingency that had now become the plan. I drove to a small office space I had leased 2 weeks earlier under Altovia's name. Ilara and Darian were already there. Having received my prearranged signal, a simple text message reading, "Horizon activated." "So they actually did it," Darian said as I walked in. "Not a question." During the Tridentor presentation, I confirmed, setting my bag down on what would become my new desk. Ilara's eyes widened slightly. "They fired you while you were pitching a $72 million deal. That's short-sighted," I finished for her. "And it's going to cost them considerably more than they realize." Within an hour, we had activated all the systems we'd prepared. Altovia went from contingency to reality with remarkable efficiency. We weren't starting from scratch. We were simply flipping the switch on something that had been built methodically in the shadows. Meanwhile, at Rivenix, the first tremors of what would become a seismic shift were beginning to register. The first came from Tridentor itself. Their chief technology officer, Ariana Myers, sent an email to Grayson. "We were impressed with Maren Blake's presentation this morning and are prepared to move forward as discussed. Please confirm that Maren will be our primary contact for implementation planning." Grayson's response, crafted with help from legal and HR, was carefully worded. "We're pleased you found the presentation valuable. Our implementation team, led by Lucian Vall, is ready to proceed with next steps. Lucian will be your primary point of contact moving forward." Ariana's reply came swiftly. "We would prefer to continue working with Maren Blake, who has demonstrated exceptional understanding of our needs throughout this process. Please clarify if this is possible." This exchange, which I learned about later through my remaining contacts at Rivenix, was the first indication that things weren't going to proceed as smoothly as the company had anticipated. The next signal came when Tridentor unexpectedly postponed the contract signing meeting that had been scheduled for the following week. The official reason given was internal review requirements, but the real message was clear. They were hesitating. While Rivenix scrambled to salvage the situation, I made my first strategic move. I sent a simple, factual email to Ariana Myers. "I wanted to inform you that, as of today, I am no longer with Rivenix Group. I appreciate our professional interactions and wish Tridentor success with your customer engagement transformation. If I can be of assistance in the future under my new venture, Altovia Systems, please don't hesitate to reach out." No accusations, no bitterness, just a straightforward notification followed by a simple statement of my new professional reality. Ariana's response came within 20 minutes, not to my email, but in the form of a message to Grayson and the Rivenix leadership team. "We are putting all contract discussions on hold, pending a full reassessment of partnership options. Please cancel all scheduled meetings until further notice." Inside Rivenix, the panic was immediate but contained. Grayson called an emergency meeting with the executive team, Lucian prominently positioned at his right hand. They strategized damage control, crafted persuasive arguments, prepared concessions to offer Tridentor. What they didn't understand was that the damage couldn't be controlled because they didn't comprehend its nature. This wasn't about offering a better price or additional services. This was about trust and relationships, the foundations I had carefully built over 8 months that they had casually discarded in 8 seconds. A week passed, then another. Tridentor remained politely distant, responding to Rivenix's increasingly desperate outreach with vague reassurances about continuing to evaluate options. Then came the moment that should have alarmed Rivenix more than anything else. Ariana Myers requested a meeting with me at Altovia's new offices. The space was modest but thoughtfully designed. We had leased a single floor in a building across town from Rivenix, furnished it simply but professionally, and established our digital infrastructure with remarkable speed. By the time Ariana arrived, Altovia looked and functioned like a company that had existed for years rather than weeks. "I'll be direct. Marin," she said once we were seated in the conference room, "we've invested significant time in this transformation project, and your understanding of our needs has been the primary reason we were prepared to move forward with Rivenix." I nodded but said nothing, letting her continue. "What happened?" she asked. "Why would they remove you from our account without any transition or even notification to us?" "I believe Rivenix is undergoing some internal restructuring," I replied neutrally. "They're entitled to make personnel decisions they feel are in the company's best interest." Ariana studied me for a moment. "That's a very diplomatic answer." I smiled slightly. I prefer to focus on the future rather than dwell on the past. "And what does that future look like for Altovia Systems?" she asked, getting to the real purpose of her visit. "We're a strategic implementation firm specializing in customer engagement transformations," I explained. "Our approach emphasizes deep understanding of client needs, customized solutions, and flawless execution. We're small but focused, which allows us to be nimble and dedicated to the projects we undertake." What I didn't need to say, was that Altovia could deliver exactly what I had promised Tridentor in my Rivenix presentation, because the intellectual architecture behind that proposal had come from my mind, not from Rivenix's systems. "Would you be able to handle a project of our scale?" Ariana asked the obvious question. "We have the expertise and frameworks in place," I assured her, "and we're structured to scale our resources as needed for implementation. What we don't compromise on is the strategic oversight and accountability." 2 days later, Tridentor officially terminated all discussions with Rivenix and requested a formal proposal from Altovia Systems. When the news reached Rivenix, the impact was seismic. Grayson called me personally, his voice tight with controlled anger. "What did you do?" "Marin," he demanded, "did you sabotage us with Tridentor?" "I informed them that I was no longer with Rivenix," I replied calmly. "That's all. They made their own decisions based on that information." "You took our client." His voice rose slightly. "They were never your client, Grayson. They were considering becoming a client, and they chose to work with the person they trusted to deliver what they needed." "We'll fight this legally," he threatened. "Your contract has non-compete clauses." "Which apply to existing clients, not prospective ones," I countered. "Alara drafted those clauses. Remember, she understands exactly what they do and don't prohibit." The silence that followed told me he recognized the trap. Rivenix's own legal framework, which I had helped shape during my time there, had created the very pathway I was now using to establish my independence. "This isn't over," he said finally. "It is for me," I replied, and ended the call. The Tridentor account was just the beginning. Within a month, 2 other major prospects that I had been cultivating at Rivenix also reached out to Altovia. Like Tridentor, they were more interested in working with the strategist they trusted than with the company logo on the business card. Meanwhile, Rivenix was experiencing unexpected turbulence. Their engagement metrics, how frequently clients accessed their systems and documentation, showed a sharp decline. Without my ongoing relationship management, existing accounts were becoming less active, less responsive, less invested in the Rivenix ecosystem. Inside the company, rumors about my departure had spread, morphing with each retelling. Some said I had been poached by a competitor. Others claimed I had resigned after a disagreement with leadership. No one seemed to know I had been fired mid-presentation, but everyone felt the vacuum created by my absence. Talia, the junior strategist who had been positioned as my replacement, was struggling under the weight of expectations she wasn't prepared to meet. Lucian, for all his charisma, lacked the deep understanding of client needs that came from years of focused relationship building. The merger of the 3 strategic divisions, the one I had originally designed, was proceeding, but haltingly, without the nuanced approach I had outlined in my original proposal. The integration was creating friction rather than synergy. Teams that should have been collaborating were competing for resources and recognition. 3 months after my departure, Rivanix lost another major account, not to Altovia, but to a different competitor altogether. The client cited changes in strategic support as their reason for switching providers. A week later, a third account announced they were reevaluating their partnership strategy. The dominoes were falling, not because I was actively pushing them, but because Rivanix had removed the very person who had been holding them in place. Altovia, meanwhile, was growing with controlled precision. We had hired selectively, bringing on only those professionals who shared our commitment to strategic excellence and client-focused solutions. Our reputation was spreading through the industry not through marketing, but through results. Tridentor's transformation was proceeding ahead of schedule and under budget. 6 months after my termination, Altovia and Rivanix found themselves competing for a major new account, a global retail chain seeking to overhaul their customer loyalty program. It was the kind of high-profile project that could establish Altovia as a major player in the field. The final presentations were scheduled for the same day. Rivanix sent Lucian, now promoted to Chief Strategy Officer, along with a team of 4 specialists. Altovia sent me, along with Alara and our newly hired Customer Experience Director. We presented second, which meant we entered the conference room just as the Rivanix team was leaving. Lucian's eyes met mine briefly, his confident smile faltering for just a moment before he recovered and nodded professionally. I returned the nod and continued into the room without breaking stride. Our presentation was everything the Rivanix one wasn't: focused, substantive, and precisely tailored to the client's specific needs. We didn't overwhelm them with technical jargon or impressive-sounding buzzwords. We simply demonstrated, with calm authority, that we understood their challenges and had developed a practical framework for addressing them. We won the account, not because of any lingering resentment I held toward Rivanix, but because Altovia was simply better at delivering what this client needed. The news sent another shockwave through Rivanix. Losing Tridentor had been dismissed as an anomaly, a client unusually attached to a specific strategist. Losing to Altovia in a head-to-head competition was different. It was a direct market judgment on the relative value of the two companies. A week later, I received an unexpected message from Talia, my former mentee and supposed replacement at Rivanix. "Can we meet for coffee?" the message read. "There are things happening here you should know about." We met at a quiet cafe halfway between our respective offices. Talia looked tired, the kind of bone-deep exhaustion that comes from trying to succeed in an impossible situation. "They're imploding," she said without preamble once we were seated. "The merger is a disaster. Departments aren't communicating. Projects are stalling. Clients are getting frustrated." I sipped my coffee, listening. "Lucian is blaming everyone but himself," she continued. "He keeps saying the framework is sound, but the execution is flawed. But everyone knows the framework itself has gaps that weren't in your original design." "How do they know about my original design?" I asked, genuinely curious. Talia gave me a small, knowing smile. "You think people don't talk? Those of us who worked closely with you recognize your thinking. We can see where your architecture has been altered, and not for the better." I considered this. "Why are you telling me this, Talia?" She looked down at her cup. "Because I'm leaving Rivanix. Several of us are, and I wanted your advice on where to go next." I studied her for a moment. She had talent, no question, and she had clearly learned something valuable about corporate loyalty in recent months. "Send me your updated resume," I said finally. "Altovia is growing. We might have a place for someone with your insights." 2 weeks later, Talia joined Altovia as our senior client relations specialist. She brought with her not only her own talents, but also insights into Rivanix's increasingly desperate attempts to stop the bleeding. Grayson had initiated a company-wide renewal initiative, essentially an admission that the merger wasn't working as planned. Lucian had been quietly shifted from Chief Strategy Officer to the newly created position of Innovation Director, a title with less direct client contact and more internal focus. Morgan from HR had left the company entirely, replaced by a veteran professional known for handling corporate turnarounds. 9 months after my termination, the final blow fell. Rivanix's board of directors called an emergency meeting and voted to remove Grayson as CEO. The official announcement cited strategic differences as the reason, but the financial results told the real story. Client retention had fallen by 22%. New acquisitions were down 35%, and the company's stock had dropped to its lowest point in 5 years. Lucian disappeared from the company website shortly thereafter. No announcement, no farewell message, just another name quietly erased, much as mine had been from the merger proposal that started this cascade. I didn't celebrate these developments. There was no satisfaction in watching the implosion of a company where I had invested 5 years of my professional life. Many good people still worked there, people who had nothing to do with the decisions that led to my termination. Instead, I focused on building Altovia into everything Rivanix could have been, but chose not to be. A company that valued strategic thinking, respected intellectual contribution, and placed client needs at the center of every decision. 1 year to the day after that fateful notification slid across my tablet screen, I walked through the main entrance of Altovia's new headquarters. We had outgrown our original space and moved to a full building near the city center. The lobby featured a simple but elegant sign, the Altovia logo with my name discreetly etched beneath it as founder and CEO. Tridentor's implementation had been completed successfully, on time and under budget. They had already contracted with us for 2 additional projects. The retail chain's loyalty program overhaul had exceeded all performance metrics, becoming a case study in effective digital transformation. Altovia now employed 28 people, including 7 former Rivanix staff who had joined us seeking a more meritocratic environment. As I stood in that lobby, I reflected on the journey. I had never sought revenge against Rivanix. I had never publicly disparaged them or revealed the circumstances of my departure. I had simply built something better, something that honored strategic thinking and client relationships rather than internal politics and credit-taking. In the end, that was more devastating to Rivanix than any revenge could have been. They hadn't just lost an employee when they fired me mid-presentation, they had lost their future. I was mid-sentence when HR fired me in front of 12 executives. I spent 8 months building that deal. They fired me in 8 seconds. They thought silencing me would kill my influence. Instead, it killed their entire future pipeline. Because I had already built something they couldn't touch. My reputation, my relationships, my strategic vision. And those things didn't belong to Rivanix. They never did. They belonged to me. When I walked out of that presentation room with dignity intact, I wasn't ending my career. I was simply beginning its next, better chapter. My name is Marin Blake, founder and CEO of Altovia Systems, and this is just the beginning of our story. I sometimes think about that notification sliding onto my screen. Employment terminated, effective immediately. 6 words meant to end something. Instead, they began everything that followed. The irony isn't lost on me. In trying to silence me, Rivanix gave me the push I needed to find my true voice. In trying to claim my work as their own, they freed me to create something authentically mine. In firing me during my greatest professional moment, they unwittingly launched me toward even greater achievements. I never needed to fight them or expose them or destroy them. They did that themselves the moment they decided I was dispensable while my work was not. All I needed to do was walk away, taking with me the one thing they couldn't claim in their termination notice, my mind. Everything else followed naturally from there. 2 years have now passed since that day. Altovia has grown to a staff of 43, with offices in 3 cities. Rivanix still exists, but in diminished form, having been partially acquired by a larger competitor who valued their client list more than their operational structure. Grayson occasionally appears at industry events, always careful to avoid direct contact with me. Lucian has reinvented himself at a startup across the country. His online profile scrubbed of specific dates regarding his time at Rivanix. As for me, I no longer define myself in opposition to them. Altovia has its own identity now, its own culture, its own place in the market. We are known for strategic excellence, flawless implementation, and unwavering client focus. All values I once tried to instill at Rivanix, now flourishing in soil more conducive to their growth. The lesson, I suppose, is that true power doesn't reside in titles or organizational authority. It resides in the value you create and the relationships you build. Those things can't be taken from you with a termination notice, no matter how abruptly it arrives. They can only be carried forward, transforming from potential energy to kinetic force when the constraints of an unsuitable environment are suddenly removed. I was mid-sentence when HR fired me. I finished that sentence, and then I started writing an entirely new story, one where I held the pen. That's the thing about trying to silence someone who truly has something to say. The voice always finds a way to be heard, sometimes more powerfully than before. In firing me, Rivanix didn't end my influence, they amplified it. And I didn't need to say a single word about what they did. I simply had to succeed where they were beginning to fail. That has been revenge enough. The most satisfying part isn't seeing Rivanix struggle or watching former colleagues seek positions at Altovia. It's building something that embodies my values without compromise, creating a company where strategic thinking is valued, where credit is given where due, where success is measured by client outcomes rather than internal politics. In a way, I should thank them for that notification that slid onto my screen 2 years ago. Without it, I might still be fighting those internal battles, trying to change a culture resistant to the very values that now define Altovia. Instead, I'm free to lead according to my own vision, surrounded by people who share that vision not because they fear the consequences of disagreement, but because they genuinely believe in our approach. That freedom is worth far more than the temporary discomfort of an unexpected termination. So if there's a moral to this story, perhaps it's this: sometimes being silenced is the universe's way of telling you you've been speaking in the wrong room all along. Find the right room, or build it yourself, and your voice will not only return, but resonate more powerfully than you ever imagined possible. I built Altovia not to compete with Rivanix, but to create what Rivanix could never become. A company where strategy wasn't just a department but a mindset, where client relationships weren't just accounts but partnerships, where intellectual contribution wasn't something to be claimed but something to be cultivated. That clarity of purpose has been our true competitive advantage. In the end, HR didn't fire me, they freed me. And in trying to ensure I exited their systems, they unwittingly launched me into creating a better one. That notification was meant to be an ending. Instead, it was the beginning of everything that mattered. My name is Maren Blake, and this is my company, built with my mind, guided by my values, successful on my terms. No one can take that away with a 6-word message. No one ever will.